Previously in Hedge Knights, Arauco departed the bison glade in the middle of the night without saying goodbye. The Adlets were besieged by raiders who were staging but never committed to assaulting the keep. Snow fell while the Adlets attempted to clean more of the southern farm field to take advantage of sowing early in the season. Fields of hillroot, mackey, and flax were planned for the newly purified fields. Episode 32: Spring Cleaning. Despite how laborious it was to clean and work the farm fields, the Adlets enjoyed their time with good company and the warm sun upon their fur. It had been some time since the last smog, and the air seemed more clear than usual. Slowly but surely, the entire inner courtyard was becoming increasingly lush and vivacious. The progress on the border wall was slow, but was also nearing completion. Building raised piers and bridges took considerably more timber and time than the Adlets had originally thought, as the marsh was deep and tricky to work in, but they had a lot to show for their progress. While the southeastern swamp would take a fair bit more effort to complete, the rest of the sections were just days away from being finished. Finally, the slow-growing hillroot was harvested and processed into medicines. Megahoof was waiting impatiently to brew up more hybrid extract, worried the Ambrosia would spoil before he had the chance to use it for his concoction. As eager as he was to brew up a full batch of 3, he didn't want to deplete the medicine stockpiles to a dangerous level. Once 3 extracts were finished, they could send the bison and some Adlets out for another batch of salix trees. Megahoof made sure the bread shelves were well stocked before starting to brew the latest batch of extract. While the Adlets had an abundance of tea made from a bumper harvest the previous year, Sapo and Lazarus hadn't sown any psychoid leaves yet this year, and Megahoof made a mental note to remind them before it was too late. The Adlets were nearly done preparing the fields clear to the southern curtain wall, a significant milestone they had been working towards for many seasons. While the Adlets subsisted on mead, bread, and tea, Sapo promised their hard work would be paid in full once the crops came in, with delicious lentil soups and pumpkin fritters. Besides the Adlets' paltry sum of silver, Arauco had taken a considerable amount of dried meat, so both farmers made sure to plant a lot more mackey in order to process it into traveling meals, so the adventuring party could easily stave off hunger while investigating the ruins. Mackey was rather dry and mealy, not a very pleasant thing to solely eat when exploring. If they rationed their dried meat and brought mead and tea, the reliance upon mackey wouldn't be so rough. The increasing purity of the glade soil meant that sprouting ambrosia was becoming a more commonplace occurrence. It cropped up almost like a weed, and if it wasn't a crucial ingredient for stabilizing salix trees, the Adlets might even be frustrated, given how many of their sown crops end up destroyed and overrun by the elusive bushes. The farmers hoped the supply of Nutrifungus would sustain the bison long enough for the next harvest to resupply the shelves, but the bison were hungry without food to eat, so the Adlets would have to offer up hay grass instead. As soon as the Adlets noticed the hungry bison, they worked to haul the bales of hay into the pen. Klein's health was degrading, and he realized he needed to take a break from working beyond the walls to recover from his exposure. He was happy not to have to be periodically visited by Sapo for blood poisoning treatments, so instead of checking in with Sapo about his illness, he decided to skip the formalities and self-impose quarantine. Time and time again, the other adlets reminded him that he had no obligation to work or fight, so he knew his time spent inside wouldn't be frowned upon, but still he busied himself with toiling tasks to pass the time. Megahoof warned Sapo and Lazarus that the boundary trees were likely going to be at maximum capacity once the farm fields were purified clear to the southern curtain wall, and they'd need to wait for the trees to absorb and process the pollution before cleaning any more, where they'd run the risk of repolluting purified soils. Sapo and Lazarus let the other adlets know that all that was left to do in the spring season was to clean and till the fields to the southern wall, which felt like an easily obtainable goal to the others, so they raced to get it finished. The work also allowed the masons to remain busy when recovering from the polluted marshes, so it was a winning objective for all. With the bison running out of food, Megahoof started to mill the wheat by hand on the millstone to build up more of a supply of hay grass. He asked Sapo and Lazarus what they thought about leaving the Nutrifungus field to grow year-round, and they both approved of the idea. Sapo told Megahoof they need to occasionally supplement the bison's diet with other foods to avoid diseases, but fungus could mostly cover the animal's food needs. While the squires hoped to have the bison grazing openly, it wasn't a realistic goal for the near future. Megahoof asked Tangier and Judea to brainstorm ways to keep the Nutrifungus farm as a permanent room inside the keep without it getting in the way, and once the bison had enough fungus to eat, they could rework the room as they saw fit. Tangier nodded and told Judea she'd start sketching different ways to alter the floor plan, and Judea said she'd do the same. At least for now, they could knock down the temporary door, but overhauling the structure would be best for the long term. As Bash matured, he took after both of his parents more and more. He was fascinated by books and science, with an insatiable thirst for knowledge just like his father, and also enjoyed playing with bricks and timber, building small, tiny-scale villages and castles while imagining himself as a knight during the High Kingdoms. Although his parents seldom allowed him to play with weapons, only offering him the briefest of safety lessons, Madzie would sometimes sneak him out beyond the curtain wall, and the two would shoot at gray pine trees, something he rather enjoyed. The goal of cleaning the soils all the way up to the southern curtain wall was generating a lot of displaced pollution. It was difficult to imagine the time when the keep managed their pollution with just 3 trees. Now they had over a dozen, and still the trees struggled to keep up with the adlet's progress. Megahoof planned on brewing up another extract so that a group could be dispatched to uproot and treat 3 new trees to continue replanting the boundary grove, which would be the closest the adlets could achieve towards a permanent bulwark against these smogs and blight. The beautiful fields of heirloom crops strengthened the once brittle ground. Through Lazarus and Sapo's careful soil management and use of bison manure and compost of spoiled food, the crops sown into the fields of the keep were hardy and strong, able to withstand the caustic air and acid rains. Somehow, in spite of the hostile environment, the flavor of the fruits and vegetables that the adlets grew were not too adversely affected. Not that they would know anyway, as much of what they ate had been functionally extinct for a century or more. Megahoof noticed one of the farmers had finished harvesting a patch of heel root and extra medicine stacked up on the shelves. He took a break from milling wheat for the bison to brew up another extract, so whoever ended up being sent out for the salix trees could return with a full caravan's worth. With much of the southern farm expansion dedicated to heelroot, Megahoof hoped he wouldn't have to carefully plan his distillation brewing around resource shortages. Ideally, they'd run out of ambrosia far before tea or medicine. During the twilight hours, Madzie was often the only one awake ever since Orelko left. She was not fond of him, and often avoided him as much as possible. He spent much of the night chiseling away at stone or hauling heavy items, and dropping them with unnecessary amounts of force, which resulted in him being inconsiderately loud while others slept. Now with him gone, the keep was whisper quiet. The crackling of hearth fires echoed off the walls, and the grunts of sleeping bison boomed off the ceiling. The responsibility of being the only lookout during the night was anxiety-provoking, but still better than having to actively avoid Orelko. She was proud about how much of the boundary wall she had contributed to. Driving piers and erecting bridges was hard work, but it was also the groundwork for a green and well-protected future. When the blight weakened her, she'd retreat to the slate mines and carefully expand her secret room deep underground. She hadn't figured out a way to circulate the air, nor access clean water, but it was her secret room as a home away from home. She wanted to show Bash and Shellbell her secret lair deep underground, but knew that their parents would likely not approve. Madzie wasn't afforded a childhood, much of it spent in hiding and fleeing from conflict. She felt the need to bring levity to the boys' lives, even if their parents disapproved. The fungus finally reached maturity, and it was swapped for the hay on the shelves. Judea asked Sapo if it was a good time to renovate the fungal farm, but Sapo said much of the field had already been resown. He wasn't aware renovations were planned, and he told her he'd hold off sowing the fungus after the next harvest. Megahoof asked if anyone wanted to go fetch the next batch of salix trees. Madzie wanted to go adventuring, but wasn't feeling too well after having spent so much time in the blighted marshes. Sapo didn't want to leave Megahoof to mill the wheat by himself, knowing it was such a dreadful chore. Tangier and Lazarus were eager to volunteer, and Judea said it was fine, she'd watch Shellbell for a day or two. Lazarus switched to his harvesting axe, which helped to cut away excess roots when uprooting trees, and Tangier made sure to quickly stitch together some bolts of wool to form a double bedroll. The couple were all set and ready to depart under the gloomy noon eclipse. They rounded up the bison, half a bale of hay, some extra bread from the pantry, the double bedroll, and 3 extracts for the root treatments. They let the others know they were headed to the northern border of the Gutraro forest, just a half-day's journey or so, and would be back as soon as they could. Sapo broke the bad news to Megahoof that he would need to manage the kitchen because with Lazarus gone, Sapo had so many pressing tasks to manage as a farmer that he likely didn't have the time for baking or milling, but promised to put time in milling when he could. The farm was almost entirely purified, clear along the southern wall. Standing at the wall and looking back at the keep northward, you'd almost forget the apocalyptic blight found blanketing the entire continent. Madzie finished the final southwestern section of the boundary wall, despite the marsh's pollution sapping her strength. She tidied up some of the unnecessary bridge sections and planned to relax in her underground room, chiseling away. To Sapo's surprise, he was actually almost finished sowing the crops in the new expanded fields, but there were still discarded burlap sacks of polluted topsoil strewn about the fields, slowly decaying, and promptly reminded Megahoof something needed to be done about the excess toxic garbage. Tangier and Lazarus arrived in the northernmost glade and settled in next to an active death stinger nest. Lazarus reassured Tangier that his armor could easily withstand strikes from their mandibles, pincers, and stinger, and there was little to be worried about. She took some poorly aimed shots at the nearest hornet and watched as it seemingly retreated back towards its nest. After firing off a dozen or so shots without landing any hits, Lazarus gently suggested that since the death stingers didn't seem particularly hostile, maybe they could sneak around and uproot the trees unharassed, hoping his suggestion wouldn't bruise her ego. The two started searching for salix trees. The first two trees were spotted just beyond the death stinger nest, and Tangier rolled her eyes and said, "Yes, of course, that's convenient," while Lazarus laughed at their poor luck. The third tree was spotted to the east, nestled next to the remnants of a grand battlefield. Tangier offered to situate the extracts in place so that Lazarus could uproot the trees, playing to their strengths. Lazarus nodded and said to holler at him if she needed any help. Tangier attempted to sneak past a death stinger hornet guard while it was patrolling around the nest. The hornet jittered towards her, and she lost her nerve, dropping the extract as she jumped back in fear. Thankfully, the extract's glass bottle landed gently in the soil and survived the fall. She gathered her nerve and fetched the bottle, having to dodge a strike from the guard. She quickly fled southward, hoping it would not pursue. She dodged and weaved around the patrolling hornets to fetch the last extract, now more annoyed by the hornets than frightened. Lazarus was nearly finished excavating the first tree, and soon he could lend her a hand. She delivered the last extract and turned eastward to see Lazarus slowly trudging through the deep marsh towards her. Instead of leaving the last two trees for him to uproot, she started digging the roots of the closest one to her as he approached. The main farm now extended clear to the southern curtain wall, and the Adlets now could have well-earned rest and relaxation, meeting their goals well before the end of spring. Due to the buildup of toxic waste, Megahoof told everyone it would be a while before they'd be back to purifying soil, because the boundary trees would need ample time to absorb what they had displaced. As Tangier finished uprooting the last tree, Lazarus stood guard and keenly watched as the hornets buzzed and bolted around them both. While Lazarus applied the last extract, Tangier notched an arrow and fired in the direction of the buzzing hornets, hoping to encourage them to flee further from them both. But instead she landed a perfect hit, felling the foul creature with one arrow. The death of their hive mate triggered the other hornets to attack the couple, and Lazarus carefully intercepted the next insect, killing it with his woodcutting axe. 2 hornets had been felled, and the remaining hornets must have smelled the adlets on the bedroll Tangier had brought, and they were shredding it as if it was an assailant. The rest of the hornets attacked, and Lazarus positioned himself in front of his wife to allow her to fire freely as he defended against their flurry of strikes. Lazarus was right. The hornets struggled to get through his thick armor. Once Lazarus finished killing the last 2 hornets, they proceeded to destroy the hive itself, making sure no more foul insects would stalk the tiny northern grove. To their surprise, at the center of the twisted hive made of animal bones and flaky gray comb shell was insect jelly, a substance they were familiar with from having to defend against insects back on Hillenor Island. Now that they were finished, they packed up camp, happy to have survived the trip and also to be returning home with 3 salix trees. The 2 shared a bit to eat, and Tangier apologized for firing on the hornets, triggering them to aggressively attack. Lazarus said it was good that they purged the grove of those twisted creatures. His bruises were mild, and now they knew that the hornets were little threat for future encounters. Magoof let everyone know that they could haul the excess pollution to the center of the boundary trees. He hoped the couple would return soon with 3 more salix to help clean up the mess they made clearing the new fields. Lazarus and Tangier packed up their camp and headed back towards home. The romantic getaway may have been ruined, but they had a funny story to tell the rest of the adlets once they returned home, about how Tangier accidentally killed a hornet and triggered the hive to swarm. Thank you for watching episode 32 of Hedge Knights. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. If you would like to support me more directly, a link to Patreon can be found in the description of this video. If you would like to join my gaming community or a Twitch stream, my schedule and link to Discord can be found on my website, Rhadamant.com. Thank you so very much for watching, and I hope to catch you next episode. Farewell, my fellow adlets.